Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It's Sunday, March 30th, 2025, and on Sundays we tackle the purpose and meaning of life. I'm going to be taking a slightly different angle on that theme today. I'm going to start, though, with a little bit of an anecdote. Not much of one, but nonetheless, it'll help set the stage. I can only imagine what it must have been like for my grandparents, specifically on my father's side, and what they might have experienced in their travels from Poland to the United States over a century ago. I hope to be able to tell that story a bit more fully and more accurately some point down the road. For the moment, though, I just wanted to mention that they were both born in the early 1890s in Poland, and then they immigrated separately. They hadn't met yet, but they immigrated separately to the United States at some point in the first decade of the 20th century. So as Polish immigrants, they likely arrived in New Bedford, Massachusetts, although I have to confirm that. And they would have been drawn by the textile industry. It was booming at that point, especially in New Bedford. And their ethnic brethren established the first Polish parish, Our Lady of Perpetual Help, in 1903. So my grandparents likely would have arrived only a few years later, since that's where they would have had this much more supportive Polish-speaking community. Now, my father and his two sisters did speak occasionally of their time growing up in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and especially of their parents' long hours spent working on the massive weaving looms of the textile mills. So I just imagine a little bit more romantically, if you will, what my grandparents might have been like and how they might have met in some alternative history. I'm imagining that they arrived, again, separately, but they arrived somehow in New York, and they would have, arrived on the famed Ellis Island. That would have been their port of entry. And then somehow, and again, in my imagined version of the story, somehow they would have managed to go visit the Statue of Liberty. And I would have imagined that they would have then actually met there, standing in awe and talking in Polish with one another. And then they'd have found someone who's bilingual, who speaks both Polish and English, because they didn't speak any English. And then that person would have then translated Emma Lazarus's poem, The New Colossus, etched in the bronze plaque within the pedestal, the Statue of Liberty. And here's what they would have heard if the translator had done their job properly. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-abridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep ancient lands your storied pomp, cries she with the silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. And so I imagine how inspired my grandparents would have been before settling happily in New Bedford to start their lives anew together in the promised land of the United States of America. And later, my father would have been born, and he was, as the youngest of three children, born in 1916, and much later he would have married my mother, of a quite different ethnic and geographic set of roots. And then, in truth, the two of them did have 6 children, of which I was the youngest. And though the last of 6 children, I somehow ended up being the one named Joseph after my father. And while I grew up in Virginia, I somehow ended up settling in Canada and now live in London, Ontario, some 2 hours west of Toronto by car, not by sea. And so, what does any of this have to do then with the purpose and meaning of life? Well, everything. If we're granted the privilege of life as human beings, then we all have to live somewhere. Of course, at least initially, we're born in a specific historical era, not of our choosing, on a specific date, again, not of our choosing. And then we're the offspring of parents we didn't choose either. And yet here we are. And somehow you, my dear friend, happen to be watching or listening to this vlog as well. So here we are together. Welcome. I just want to focus a bit more then in today's vlog on the living somewhere part of the equation and how that relates to the purpose and meaning of our lives. I've given this considerable thought over the years, both in thinking about my own family's migration history and then having chosen to migrate myself from one country to another. Now, sure, it was just from the United States to Canada. I had nowhere near the problems or the struggles that my Polish immigrant grandparents had. And yet, it's still a big deal. It's a big deal culturally, nationally, linguistically to a much smaller degree in my case, and certainly geographically, among other things. So even though we work a lot online these days, and to a greater and greater degree, there's still a physical location where we have to wake and sleep and wake again and breathe and walk and eat and then live out our lives. That physical location necessarily relates to the purpose that we find in our lives and how we end up fulfilling our life's mission, whatever that might be. We are temporarily occupying physical space and land while we are here living our lives for maybe as much as 100 years, perhaps, before our bodies are, of course, returned to nature, to soil, to sand, to sea. Our bodies are just these temporary vessels that contain our minds and our spirits, and some would suggest too, even our souls. I learned these lessons, as you probably did as well, very early in life. But I wasn't quite sure what all that meant. I think I understand much better now. In part, though, I had to learn and process and then reprocess all of the information that I'd gathered over the years about where I stand and where we stand in relation to nature and the earth. And where do we stand in relation to land? As the former associate academic dean at my university, I had the privilege of meeting with our resident elder, Liz Akawenzi, and I met with her on several occasions. I have a whole notebook, in fact, that's filled with what I learned from her, an indigenous woman who also happened to have survived the residential school system. And what's remarkable about these meetings is that if you consider the fact that I, as a white male Catholic, came at these meetings and held these discussions with Liz from an entirely different kind of cultural perspective and worldview, or background, I should say. What we discovered, though, was that our philosophies and that our worldviews were actually remarkably similar to one another's. So I hope maybe to do a vlog someday with Liz, or if not with Liz directly, then perhaps by sharing some of the wisdom that's scribbled down in these pages upon pages of notes that I took from our conversations. So we'll see. But today I just want to mention briefly why I've never felt like someone who owns the land in the contemporary or the fullest sense of that term. I'll not be quoting Elder Liz Akawenzi per se, but I'm just going to be offering my own particular take on the matter in relation to my life's purpose and what I find to be especially meaningful. So, for example, I've always been blessed to live surrounded by trees and often forests where I grew up. And indeed, I grew up barefoot and playing outside in nature quite a bit. We only put on tennis shoes or cleats when we were going to compete with one another in sports. My first serious long-term job was as 4 years as a landscaper. Russell's Nursery, for those who are watching this and remember Russell's Nursery. And no matter where I've lived, and indeed, to the extent that I've ever owned land, I've always felt that you can really never have too many trees on one's property. I mean, I know that's an exaggeration. It's not literally true. But I've always planted trees, several trees, on any of the actual properties where I've been an owner as such or had title to the property. So, and what does this really have to do with our life's purpose? And how does this affect how I see the world then? Well, again, the broader philosophical, almost existential question is, do we really own the land? Is that really at the core of our life's purpose? Indeed, do you see acquiring more and more and more land as being at the core of your life's purpose? And some people truly do. They seem to focus on the desire and the active pursuit of acquiring and owning as much land as possible. And what if our tribes or our nations are intent upon acquiring more and more land? Could that lead to some problems? I'm reminded of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Discourse on Inequality, where he wrote the following back in 1755. The first person who, having enclosed a plot of land, took it into his head to say, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe them, was the true founder of civil society. What crimes, wars, murders, what miseries and horrors would the human race have been spared had someone pulled up the stakes or filled in the ditch and cried out to his fellow men, "Do not listen to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits of the earth belong to all, and the earth to no one." End quote. And in my most serene and enlightened moments, I genuinely feel that sentiment deeply, almost defiantly at times. I really don't personally want to own the land, even though, in fact, in a technical sense, in a property rights sense, I do own some land. Let's be real. Most people in Canada and the United States, for example, aspire to own their own homes, to have some property. In fact, about 2/3 of households in both countries own their own houses, or the banks do. They're trying to own their own houses. And so that's the way we've chosen to live our lives, to organize ourselves in the 21st century. Even my elder friend that I mentioned, Liz Akuenzi, would mention that, hey, indigenous peoples too have mortgages to pay these days. That's part of the world that we live in. That's the reality of contemporary society. But in the next breath, she'll also mention too that it'd be nice if we had more spaces, for example, outdoors at King's, where we could meet, instead of having to meet always inside in the concrete buildings, even though our Student Life Center is a lovely building. So my main point today then is that owning land does not, or at least should not, be at the core of one's life purpose. My grandparents on my father's side struggled to earn a living in those textile mills. They never were wealthy, and I don't know that they ever owned any property or land per se. Those on my mother's side lived more directly off of the land as farmers. That doesn't make them superior or noble or anything, because they too were still trapped with the prejudices of their own backgrounds, their own upbringings, their own limited cultural exposure, if you will. But more than anything else, they too, just like all of us, had to deal with who owns and controls the land, who has valid land claims, who has the right to what and whatever they like with their land. A quick anecdote, then, will hopefully drive home the central theme. So on my mother's side, as I said, the farming side of the family, her mother, my Nana, grew up on a farm in Texas. Now, her father, my great-grandfather, had a dispute with a neighbor, a fellow farmer. So my great-grandfather, the dispute was about the fact that he'd cleared some land to allow for a drive for easier access to his property. The problem? His next-door neighbor was aggrieved because he had, in building this access road, he had encroached upon the neighbor's lawn, or the neighbor's property. And so what did the neighbor do? Well, he shot my great-grandfather to settle the dispute. He shot him in the back. Didn't kill him. It left him, though, permanently paralyzed and unable to walk again. My Nana was the one who actually nursed him and looked after him, at least until he died a few years later. He never pressed charges, though, against the neighbor. Why not? Well, my grandmother was one of 11 children, and they could manage their own farm, even though, again, my great-grandpa could no longer work, no longer walk. But great-grandpa worried that his neighbor wouldn't be able to hold down the farm. They had a much smaller family, and he absolutely had to work in order for them to be able to maintain the farm. So if he'd been convicted, as he surely would have been, then that would have destroyed the entire family. So great-grandpa understood that the man needed to be able to work the land in order to feed his family. It's a remarkable story. So again, I guess I've always known that obviously most people then, and throughout history, have staked out claims for land, and most people, certainly these days, try to own their own land. But I've always wondered about the cost of owning land. Now again, I don't mean the economic cost, of course, rather the cultural costs, and the costs associated with the human condition, a la Rousseau, whom I quoted. Anyone listening to this vlog is all too aware that there are countless conflicts, and there have been historically, and of course even down to the present, that center around land claims. There are over 300 national land borders these days, and of course there are islands as well that stake out their own claims. They just don't have borders in the formal sense, and we're talking about land borders. So we've split up the world, we've divvied up the world in terms of these land claims by various peoples. So there are, in that sense too, and beyond just the formal borders, of course, there are millions upon millions of private property or landowners, right? Individuals, maybe yourselves or myself. And then, of course, countless more corporations and government holdings. So, and then if we're being civil, what do? We'll respect those land and property rights, and presumably then without violence. We don't condone violence, right? But that begs the question, how can one ever own land without violence? And that includes every tribe everywhere on the planet that has ever staked out their territory and effectively made land claims. So look, I get it. It's 2025. Okay? And like you, I too need some space, right, to work and to live and to fulfill my life's mission. I'd just like to suggest with today's vlog that if we have to divide the land up and the people and make ownership claims, let's at least try to do that in pursuit of our loftier aims, our loftier ends. If owning land personally or tribally or even nationally is the end goal, then we've missed the true point of living on this planet, in my view. And I truly and deeply mean that. What land do my grandparents or even my parents own? Nothing. Nothing anymore. They're all gone now. Just as the verse from the Book of Common Prayer suggests, ashes to ashes and dust to dust. And I was never the best Catholic, obviously. I'll be the first to admit that growing up. And I'm no biblical scholar, but I did absorb a lot of the messaging along the way. I realized that we come from dust and we return to dust. I learned that we should be eternally humble in light of that fact. I learned that no matter what earthly success or riches we accrue, or land we might own, none of that matters when it comes to God, when it comes to eternity. That's what I learned from religion. And from my science classes, I learned that the land is going to be here in some form or another, regardless of human beings, and it'll continue to exist billions of years from now, or at least until the end of the sun, our sun's current life. That's somewhere upwards of 5 billion years from now. And then I also learned in music something about the land too, especially from the 5-man electrical band and their song Signs, right? Anybody remember that one? And the signs said anybody caught trespassing would be shot on sight. So I jumped on the fence and I yelled at the house, hey, what gives you the right to put up a fence to keep me out or to keep Mother Nature in? Well, if God was here, he'd take it to your face. Man, you're some kind of sinner. Signs, signs everywhere. All right, let me stop there. You get the point, right? So that's from Signs. And the lyrics, that always struck me. Again, I learned that as a kid, for goodness sakes, right? So putting together faith and science and music, I'm just grateful to spend as much time as I can here above the ground, right? To lead a purposeful and meaningful life, regardless of whether or not I own that patch of ground. If I can help that patch of ground bear fruit and sustenance, then I know I'll have done something good. If I can stand on that patch of ground, of course, as but a temporary visitor, again, we're all just visiting, but if I can stand on that patch of ground or sit here typing at the computer and do something useful and creative and helpful, again, then I'll know I'm fulfilling my life's purpose. For the global we, my message then would be, if we're taking or hurting or exploiting or destroying the land, especially because we think we own the land or we're entitled to this or that patch of land, or if we're hurting or exploiting or destroying others who stand on that land, then we've fundamentally lost our way. I don't care which side of the conflict you're on. You have fundamentally lost our way. And people will come up with all kinds of justifications for why they or their group's entitled to this or that patch of land. And as a result, many of them would be more than willing to kill others, to defend their land, or shoot their neighbor in the back, as happened to my great-grandfather. But I know that in our truly most thoughtful and enlightened states of mind, we understand that that's not at the heart of our life's purpose. And if we do happen to own some land, What would be the point if we never had any visitors or just kept that land to ourselves? What a boring and uneventful life that would be. And as the five-man electrical band also sang, and the sign said, "Everybody welcome, come in, kneel down and pray." So, and in so doing, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives and nurture love in your hearts and share hugs and your land in abundance. Until next time, Dr. J out.